Welcome, everyone, to the How to Be Happy podcast. I am so excited to have my guest, Annie, on today for a reason I'm going to get to in a couple minutes, but I'm going to hit her right out of the gate with a really big question. Annie, well, first of all, welcome.
Thank you. Happy to be
So,
here.
is it true that your unconscious mind, your subconscious brain, can actually create behavioral patterns in your life that negatively affect you, your relationships, your business, your health, and you don't even know it?
Yes, 100%. It's what's known as our blind spot of the subconscious brain because the subconscious brain runs at 11 million data points a second. Your conscious brain only runs at 40 data points a second, which means there's something hidden in your subconscious that you don't know and that is causing you to run on autopilot with certain things in your life where you can't even see the problems of limitations you're setting up for yourself.
Wow. And now why I'm so excited to have you. We're going to jump into that even more, dive into that more. But I was on a call with you almost exactly 2 years ago to the day. We're on a Zoom call, and I think we're 5 minutes in. I can remember it like it was yesterday
I
because
remember it too.
I was sitting out in the parking lot. It was a cold day. I was getting ready to go to the gym. I had this call, and I was having a call with you because my friend had said, if your son has anxiety issues, you've got to talk to Annie. So I'm like, okay, I'm going to listen to my friend. I respect him. So I got on the call with Annie. And within 5 minutes, what did Annie say? You
I
have a tick.
remember.
You have a tick. And I'm
Yep.
like, what are you talking about? I don't even know this lady. And in 5 minutes, she's telling me I have a tick. I was like, what do you mean? She's like, you blink profusely when you talk about your childhood. So you may have unresolved childhood trauma, which, why was that important to tell me at the time?
Well, it was important to tell you, I felt at the time, because if you're going to talk to me about anything with regards to your children, you first have to embody and understand what's going on in your world so that that doesn't impact them. Because that could be a source of their anxiety without you even knowing it.
So can we talk? I'm going to weave in a bunch of stories at once. Talk a little bit about that because now, because of the work you did, which I'll talk about in a second, that so profoundly changed my life. I've dedicated my life to helping people find the same freedom and happiness. Talk about when people come to you with children that have behavioral problems and they're like, well, fix my child. I don't need any help. How do you navigate that? And can you tell us why the kid usually has behavioral problems?
Yeah. So the way I usually navigate it is I say, well, if this child has behavioral problems, it's usually because of unresolved trauma that the adult or the parent has that they are not aware of. And so if you want to resolve the behavior patterns in your children that you're not enjoying, then you get to resolve the behavior patterns and the trauma patterns in yourself first, which of course parents aren't the biggest fan of hearing. But the reality is, if anything is happening with your children, it always starts with you as the parent, always. And if you can look at that first, you have a very good chance of resolving it.
So did everyone hear that? Every problem that your child has begins with you. I guess we can tweak it a little bit and say a caregiver, but most of the times kids are with their parents, right? And that's where the problems develop. So when I now look at my daughter and my son who have their own set of issues, it's a direct result of the way that I parented them and my wife at the time parented them. So Annie, is it the parents' fault?
It's not the parent's fault, because here's the thing that's really the clincher. When you can't see this stuff because it's stuck in your subconscious brain, the first time that you could actually address it and make it change in some way is the moment when you can acknowledge and understand what's truly going on. But if you spent your whole life where the subconscious is not revealed to you and you can't see these patterns, then you cannot blame yourself for not knowing how to fix it.
Right. So I think a lot of times when I talk to clients now, most of them say I have a happy childhood, 9 out of 10 of them. And then we get to talking, and I'm like, no, you really didn't. Like you had a lot of unmet childhood needs. And I'm always thinking that they're trying to protect their parents because they think that I'm going to go with like, this is your mom or dad's fault and you need to go confront them. And I'm like, no, 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 no. Your parents did the absolute best that they could do. And that's a really, really hard concept when your parent, I mean, my father used to hit me with a belt. And so it's a really hard concept to think, well, did he really do the best he could? But now looking back at how hurt he was as a human being, he really did do the best that he could do. And he thought that by hitting me with a belt, that it was teaching me something that would allow me to, I don't know, be a more productive member of society or something.
Yep, and that's really the key, right? Because their parents taught them certain things and they learned lessons from their parents, and then in subconscious brain those lessons become the survival techniques of what they use every day to exist. And so, even though in your mind now, right, looking back on it, you might be like, oh, wow, that was an intense experience for me as a kid. In that moment, your dad could have had a story that in order for me to show my son that I love him, I have to hit him with this belt to help him understand and develop as a human being. Right. And he was doing the absolute best he could with the information he had. And to be honest, so many of us, I would say 95% of the people in this world live in their trauma 24/7 without knowing it. So it's very likely that most of our parents lived in their trauma without knowing it and played out the same patterns that their parents played out as well.
And Annie, how do you see that manifesting in people's lives? The trauma part, the unresolved trauma.
Man, well, there are so many different ways. I mean, what I've noticed over the past 15 years of really studying this is that in especially entrepreneurs, right? Every single entrepreneur chooses to become an entrepreneur because of the trauma that has happened in their world. Because trauma is defined as a perceived loss of control. If you think about being an entrepreneur, every single second of every single day is typically a perceived loss of control. So if you look at that, you can identify that almost every single entrepreneur has this trauma piece that needs to be resolved. The way it shows up for business owners is you're going to attract certain people to your team with the same type of trauma that you have. You're going to limit yourself at a certain revenue amount because of the trauma that you have. I had one gentleman, Brad, which I think you'll love this story. His father had died when he was young. And when his father died, his father had only ever made $2 million. And when we ran the process on him, what we identified was that he had a story in his mind that if he made more than $2 million, he would die. And anytime he started getting close to that $2 million mark, he would literally create some health crisis for himself where he almost died because he didn't want to get into that same experience of his dad. Even though it was a deep subconscious fear, he was playing it out every single day. The second we worked on this and resolved it, he now has launched an IPO and he's making millions and millions of dollars.
Incredible, incredible. Um, so I've never heard that before, and that's fascinating to me because I took the other angle, and it's the reason I started. Well, now looking back on that, that's interesting because I didn't have control as a child. But I thought through processing my trauma that I started the company to make a lot of money because with a lot of money, I could prove my worth. So the fact that you just said that is so interesting about the control piece. So you just named one reason about how trauma affects a business and keeps you from achieving stuff. Since I've made the switch, I have attracted different people because my business isn't about making a lot of money. Now I want to make an impact on people, right?
Yes.
And everything has shifted, and we had one of our best years ever. So I'm sure, can you speak a little more to how you've seen that over all these years that you've done the work?
Oh, for sure. I mean, even if you think about just your relationships, right? As you address different aspects of your trauma, you're going to attract people into your life that have already worked through those same levels of their trauma. So you're getting the next best version of yourself with each new person you date, as long as you resolve the trauma and you learn the lesson from that person that you're dating in order to move on to the next level of learning. So I notice many times that, you're going to have reactions and different changes in your relationships because of trauma. You're going to watch behavior change in your kids because of resolving your trauma. You're going to watch the people that are magnetized into your life change because of the trauma. You're going to watch business opportunities that you never could have seen before suddenly show up once you resolve trauma. It's absolutely incredible what can happen merely by starting to look at these perceived losses of control in your life.
Incredible.
Pretty cool,
So
right?
yeah, so I've told this story 100 times, so I want to hear you tell the story. So you told me, why don't you come out to Park City? You've got this unresolved trauma, and I want you to tell the listeners what it is that you actually did with me in that 3 hour period that so profoundly changed my life.
Well, I think, just for the listeners to know, it's so different with each type of person, right? Because everybody has different unresolved trauma. Really, what we started looking at was okay, we want to look for the patterns and the trends in every perceived loss of control that happened in Brad's life. Because if we could start to identify these different traumas that occurred, then we could start to look at the pattern of those traumas. And once you understand the pattern of the traumas, you can really start to see what's the positive arc of the trauma and then what's the negative arc of the trauma. Because that will keep you in a very specific trauma loop and pattern that you will replay over and over again, but in a different context. So what I remember most about the experience with Brad was when you were able to identify, oh my God, I have made like mistakes that are millions of dollars because I'm playing out the same pattern that you just identified. And you started being able to see every single time you've been stuck in that pattern because all of a sudden now it was in those 40 data points of your conscious thought. So that just blew my mind how quickly, once you can see it, you can reference every single moment, every single memory of when that was occurring to be able to say, oh my gosh, this is a real thing. And now I can finally change it. And I think that was the moment for me that I felt the happiest for you because you could finally see it and then finally change it.
Yeah, I made 5 business mistakes that cost me $9 million, and I don't remember the positive arc and negative arc, but that's really interesting because my trauma caused me to make millions of dollars, but my trauma also caused me to lose millions of dollars, $9 million with 5 business mistakes because I was self-sabotaging. I was like, I don't deserve this, or my dad never made a bunch of money, just like you said about your first client earlier on this call. Is I just always had a way to sabotage it, which was fascinating. But business was probably the least of my concerns. It was the freedom that you allowed me to see by knowing that I had lived under these untruths for 47 years. And you talked earlier about how in business you attract your trauma. How about in relationships? do
Mm,
you want to talk about that
great.
for a little bit?
I mean, I could definitely go into this. I mean, I know for a fact, and I'll just clarify this and give you a little bit of personal detail here because I think it's relevant. So I know I was married to Larry Yatch, a former Navy SEAL. He and I have been together for 15 years. We just got separated and divorced, very amicable, very supportive of each other. And what was amazing about us was even though we've done trauma work for 15 years, when I first met him, Larry was the perfect representation of my mother and my father in a certain way. My mom, because she had two other little kids and a dog, all under the age of 5, she didn't have a lot of time for me as a little kiddo. And so I stepped into that parent role really quickly. And I think now as I look back and I'm like, oh gosh, I felt a little bit neglected, right? My father didn't really, well, I guess from the beginning, he really wanted me to be a son. And so he got me into all the sports. I played all the sports. And so my dad didn't really value that feminine part of who I was. Well, then I ended up attracting and marrying someone who was a little bit neglectful, like my mom, and also a little bit undervaluing the feminine or being afraid of the feminine, which was like my dad. So subconsciously, I might not have wanted to attract that type of person in my life, but my subconscious did that because it wanted me to try to heal this wounding that I had created for my mother and my father and some of their dynamic when I was young. Now, I love my mom and dad, they're amazing people, but I had to really look at that to make sure that I was aware and I wouldn't attract the same thing in my next partner. So, do you see how crazy it is that literally your subconscious, based on how your parents raised you, will allow you and attract for you the partner that has the trauma that will allow you to work more on your trauma? Usually it's a trauma sync up where they sync up to each other. And then you end up in this trauma pattern with each other that it is your choice. Do I want to solve this and fix this and figure this out? Or do I want to be in more suffering around it? So that's the beautiful thing and the scary thing about relationships when you have trauma.
And I did the same thing. And how many people, why do we have a 52% first divorce rate, a 60% second divorce rate, and a 72%, I think, third divorce rate? Because of this very thing, right? It's like
Unresolved
you
trauma.
you and I are married, we don't go through any work, and I'm like, it's her fault. And then I go marry Jane, and all I do is, oh, by the way, Jane's going to be really like you because that's how it works. So people are like, why do I keep, I
It's
hate this
not
word.
my relationships.
This loser. I do not like this word, but it's a word that people often use. Why do I keep attracting these losers? Well, this is why you're in a bad relationship. Why you've been in bad relationships all your life is because your subconscious mind is pulling these people in, thinking, okay, this time around,
Maybe
maybe I can
he'll
fix
work
it.
on it. Maybe she'll work on it. Maybe they'll work on it together and have something beautiful show up.
Yeah. So it's kind of like when you go through this transformation, you see the world in a different light, right?
For
I
sure.
know I know you see the world different than you did, however, 5 years ago. When I look around, I see so much suffering, right? Whether it's the obesity epidemic is insane in the United States, the drug addiction is insane, the number of prescription medication, particularly anti-anxiety and antidepressants, are going through the roof. But guess what? Hospitalizations for those things are going through the roof. So what does that tell you? They really don't work. I mean, I can go on and on and on and on. The war in Ukraine is even tied to this. So we have all of these problems in the world, And now I can see so clearly what's causing those problems. It's this unresolved trauma, which creates a lack of self love, because anyone who loves themselves can't hurt another human being. Does it just blow your mind as much as it blows my mind that there's a solution? It's a really simple. You've created one. I've created them. This perfect. Well, nothing's perfect, but this process, right, to take people through. And it's just like, why isn't this happening more? Like, why doesn't the whole world know about this?
Well, I think, there's this story about trauma, right, in our culture, which is that trauma is these big things like loss of a child, getting into a car wreck, going to war. And people tend to say inside of themselves, well, I didn't go to war or I didn't lose my child. So really, my trauma isn't important to address. Or maybe I don't have any trauma because I had a good childhood. But the key is trauma is not just these big things. We have to open up the conversation to make it be about perceived losses of control. And if you just were to look at even like your childhood years, there were probably 10 a day of perceived losses of control. But you have to have the courage to go after this conversation, knowing that it doesn't have to be painful. It doesn't have to be something that is a suffering conversation. But a lot of people, because of how society discusses trauma, they think it's going to be painful to go there.
What is it about the loss of control?
Well, whenever you have a perceived loss of control, your brain is going to create a story around that loss of control. So, I've talked about the concept of the cave person, right? That goes down to the water and sits on something that looks like a fuzzy orange and black rock. But it turns out that fuzzy orange and black rock is a tiger and it rips off half the person's face. And then this person goes back up to the cave to try to like survive it. When they get back up to their cave, they literally go to sleep that night and they dream. And as they dream, they're going to learn a lesson. And they're going to learn the same lesson over and over again, which is fuzzy orange and black things are going to kill me. They're dangerous, so I have to avoid them. Now, this is where it gets really interesting because the next day when you wake up and you're starting to heal, you want to go outside, but now you're afraid that there's a fuzzy orange and black thing behind every single bush around you. And so now your behavior changes, your mindset changes. The lesson that you learn that fuzzy orange and black things are going to kill you starts to be woven into every part of your filter for how you see the world, even though that is the farthest thing from what you really want to experience. You don't want there to be tigers everywhere, but you're going to put into reality that which you most fear from the lesson that you learned from that traumatic incident. Now, the piece here that I know you love, which I love too, is okay, but what happens if the tiger killing tribe moves in next door? Arguably, you see them and you're going to be like, oh my God, they're fuzzy orange and black things. They're going to be dangerous. I can't be around them because that's what you're used to seeing. But the reality here is that those fuzzy orange and black people are the best team for you to team up to be safe. But this is where people get into PTSD, that conversation, because on one hand, you're rewarded for being the best hunter, to be able to see these tigers everywhere, even if they don't exist. On the other hand, it seems almost too easy to step into the tiger killing tribe and never have to fear tigers again for the rest of your life. So that's where, as we look at the subconscious and conscious minds, we have to be so clear that our subconscious mind is going to block us from seeing the easiest solution to the trauma unless someone outside of us helps us to see that. And that's why the coach, is so essential for people to work on this work.
So, Annie, how, in your opinion, you've been doing this work a long time, what percentage of human beings or Americans are in this kind of fight or flight triggered state?
I mean, it's probably like 97%, but I would say probably like from the ones I've encountered, 95% at a minimum. Because I can see trauma now that I've learned how to do this. I can see trauma in so many different people, and it's usually the first thing that I observe. So I don't think I've ever met somebody who doesn't have some level of trauma.
Yeah, and I have a friend who's a neuroscientist, and he says that of those people, that we typically spend like 75% of our day in this triggered state. And
In
what can you do well from a business standpoint when you're in this fight or flight mode?
When you're in fight or flight, you can make the same decisions that push you right back into the trauma loop and cost you $9 million, right? As you know. So that's the problem, right? You're going to make decisions from fight or flight or scarcity. You're only going to see one or two options. So it's going to shut down on the thousands of other options that would exist if you were in a healthy, non-frantic state.
So you're in agreement, I think, that trauma causes lack of self-love and self-compassion, which triggers all this bad stuff, right?
Sure. Yes.
2 years ago, if someone would have said, if we were roles reversed and you'd said, "Hey, do you love yourself, Brad?" I would have said, "Yes." My shirt says, "Love yourself." But I really didn't love myself. So if someone's listening to this and they're like, "I love myself," how would you go about telling them to figure out how would they know or not if they love themselves and if they're mired in this unresolved trauma?
Well, what I would probably ask them, which is a question actually asked an individual on a discovery call today, was, okay, you tell me you love yourself. What is one thing that you love doing for yourself or with yourself? And most people are like, I don't really have a hobby. I just work all the time. Or I don't have an answer to that. What do you mean? Right? Because if you can't state one thing that you love doing for yourself, there's a gap in your level of self love and self worth.
Love it. Is that like your go-to? Is that the
It
best?
depends on the person, right? I mean,
Yeah.
that really works well for men that I
Yeah.
coach because it allows them to very quickly be like, "Yeah, I have no answer for that." Okay, well, if you did have these things and you did feel this way, you would have an answer for that because you're a brilliant man, right?
Right.
So for women, sometimes it's a little bit different because most women will always put themselves last. And so for them, it's more about when was the last time you felt truly happy or truly in love with some aspect of your life?
Interesting. Wow. So we've got all these problems. We've got all this unresolved trauma. So many people are suffering and they don't need to, right? And you have done hundreds of transformations in a matter of like hours. And I know, let me ask you this. Instead of saying I know, of the 100 plus people that you guys have taken through this crazy, amazing transformation process, how many of those people had gone to multiple therapy sessions, including some for decades?
Almost everybody, and this is what always makes me laugh because people will come on to a call with me or they'll pay me to coach them or they'll come in for an intensive and they'll be like, well, I've done therapy for like 15 years, or I'm big into personal development. I've done all those things, or oh, I've done a lot of work on myself. I'm like, okay, well, if we find something, we'll find it. And if we don't, we won't. And people are like, well, I know what it is we're going to find. I'm like, all right, let's just see. And without a shadow of a doubt, almost every single person is like, 1 hour of work with you guys is like 3 hours, or sorry, is like 30 years of therapy. They're like, this is so effective and efficient. Why didn't I do this 30 years ago? And so this is where I think the transformation that's possible in a short period of time without the suffering, that's the key to opening up possibility for people because it doesn't have to be painful to resolve these things.
Yeah, I hear that all the time too, and I'm a perfect example. I went to more marriage counseling and individual set in therapy sessions than I can even think of, and in 3 hours, you radically changed my life. And now I'm doing the same exact thing with clients. These people who have been to therapy forever, marriage counseling, and it's just like, oh my gosh, right? So why Annie? Why is it that people go to therapy sessions for hundreds of times or for 10 years and they don't get anywhere or they don't get to where they want to go? Well, why is that?
Well, I feel like, normal therapy, sometimes you're talking around the problem and you're talking the same neural pathways that got you into the problem over and over and over again. So you're rewiring the same pattern. And many times, people don't know you fast enough, well enough, or they don't have enough of a technique to get you out of the trauma loop and to show it to you, right? It takes hours and hours of time before maybe a therapist could say, hey, this might be where the problem is. But I think the cool thing about the work that we do is that there are proprietary systems that have been developed that allow you to walk somebody very quickly through so that they can logically see what's happening instead of continuing to talk about the same topic over and over again and just wire in the old pattern.
Beautiful. And do you think also it's because most therapy focuses on the conscious mind, and the conscious mind isn't a driver of this behavior that causes people so much suffering?
Yes, 100%. Yep.
Okay, so tell us how does someone go from suffering with your work? How do you do it? How do you? I know you've changed some things in your practice since I went through it. So tell us, how does it work?
Well, it all depends on the person, right? Because normally what I find is that dependent on their neurochemistry, right, where they're at neurochemically, depending on their intellect and depending on their emotional triggers, each person is a little bit customizable, but there's a process that we follow. So when I do the work with people, the first thing I always do is I walk them through this process called superpower versus kryptonite, because I want to be able to identify what is the greatest superpower of this individual and what is on the flip side of that, which causes a lot of their struggle, which is their kryptonite. Because on the, superpower is linked to your kryptonite, and that pattern shows up everywhere in your life. First, you'll be in your superpower, then you'll drive into your kryptonite. It's just a cycle that we have to identify to be able to get you out of it. So that is the very first step for everybody that I work with, because until you identify that trauma pattern, you really can't go anywhere with them, and they have to see it and have the memories pop up around it to confirm that that is their reality. So that's the first step of what I typically do.
And then where do we go from there?
Well, it all depends, right? So some people will fly out to meet with me in Park City. And when they do, then what I typically work them through is it's a full day of conscious and subconscious reprogramming, where I'm working through as they, as we work together, we'll look at different aspects of this trauma loop and we'll start seeing almost like the spider web of all the things that come off of that one thought or that one lie. And we'll look at, okay, if this is no longer a lie, if this is actually something that can be rewired or reset, what would the truth of that lie look like? What would it be? And so a lot of the times you find people like today, I was doing some work with a gentleman and he had told himself the lie that he had no time. He's like, I have no time. And I'm like, well, when you have no time, you're always going to be burned out. Are you burned out? He's like, I've been burned out for 3 years. I'm like, all right, then. So is this no time concept potentially the biggest lie ruining your life right now and creating the most suffering? His jaw dropped and he was just like, well, yes, but isn't it true that I have no time? I'm like, is it? Let's ask. And so one of the biggest questions that I will ask people, and this is probably giving away secret sauce, but I don't care because I want this to help as many people as possible. You've got to ask yourself, when you have a concept that you're so tied into, like this no time concept, you've got to ask yourself, what do I want to be true? Do I want it to be true that I have no time? Or do I want something else to be true? And do I want to live into that reality instead? That is how you get yourself out of these lies that have been running you for years.
Wow.
Thanks there.
Powerful stuff. The truth shall set you free is what I've got on the screen right now. And I tell people all the time, it's really hard to suffer if you live in the truth, right?
Very true.
And you guys got me to see that. For 47 years I lived in the untruth that I wasn't worthy and I need to fight for my worth, and there was something wrong with me, and that was just a lie. And that's the lie that most people live, that ruins their relationships and their health. And I mean, it goes on and on and on and on, right?
All linked. I mean, if you think about it, one lie creates all the stories that then impact your health, your business, your relationships, your ability to love, and your ability to feel like who you are. Everything is linked to that one lie or that one massive trauma. If you can
and
resolve it, life just gets better.
And to clarify, you said this earlier, but this is so important. People hear trauma, I think, sometimes, and they tune out. Like, I wasn't raped by someone, I wasn't molested. That is not, that is trauma for sure. But your little sister coming home from the hospital when she was born, if that made you feel like your parents loved her more than you, that is trauma, and that could create people becoming meth addicts. Really, I mean, just small things like that. So don't overlook when you hear the word trauma. There's little trauma and there's big trauma. And people always want to, including myself. When I was out in Park City, I was like, well, I got hit and I got made fun of, but why am I like this? Well, it doesn't help you at all to compare yourself to anyone on really any time. And people love to do that, right?
Oh, well, they love to, because again, it's conditioned in society, because if you're constantly comparing yourself to other people, then you're constantly not happy and then you're in a trauma loop, right? So makes sense. Every time you watch somebody be unhappy, you can always trace it back to some lie that's happening in their life or some team that they're on that's causing them to not be as effective or efficient as they could be. It's pretty amazing to watch.
Love it. Love it. Fantastic stuff. Annie, how can people reach you if they want to do this work?
Yes, if you want to do this work, northstar.annie, that's my Instagram handle. You can also email me directly at annie@northstarleadershipschool.com. The website is northstarleadershipschool.com. And also, Brad, I just want to say, like, Brad is amazing at what he does too. It is like the best thing ever to watch someone be so transformed that they want to take it on and do this work for other people. So I just want to acknowledge you, Brad, for having such a huge heart of service to others in this transformation process. I could not be more proud of you and happy for you.
Thank you so much. I told you this at the funeral we unfortunately had to attend last month, with tears running down my face, that had it not been for you making that comment and being your vulnerable self and being your truth and speaking the truth that, hey, you got a tick, I wouldn't be sitting here. The listeners wouldn't be listening to this, and I wouldn't have changed, many, many people's lives. And I've now dedicated, my goal is to live to be 110. I'm 49 years old, big into health and longevity. And I literally want to do this work till the day I die, because until you've truly found freedom, Brad Chandler, Coaching to Freedom. I used to think that was money. That was my tagline in 2017 when I was teaching real estate investors. Until you find freedom in your life, you just don't understand how beautiful life can be, right?
You don't. And freedom is everything. Love is everything. Freedom is everything. And if you can embody those things and work through this stuff, there's no limit to what you can create.
And the only way you get freedom in your life is through self-love and self-compassion. And the only way you get self-love and self-compassion is by doing this work that Annie and I are talking about, where you get rid of these silly untruths and meanings from these stressful times as a child.
100%.
So if you like the podcast, please rate it, review it, subscribe it, share it to the world. I'm trying to get this message out to as many people as I can. Annie, is there any last things that just like any profound thoughts you've had over all the years of doing this in the next 30 seconds? You should just drop a nugget for us.
Sure. Here's a nugget. So what I would tell you is that your greatest gift, your complete calling in life, comes from resolving your trauma and identifying your trauma. So if you're sitting out there wondering, like, what is my purpose? Why am I here? What is my calling? The way you get to that calling and the way you create ripple effects in this world are you go to that trauma, you figure it out, and then you see what the most amazing gift is and the reason why you're here to help humanity. So don't give up on yourself. Go after your purpose. Go after your calling. Go ahead and look at that unresolved trauma so that you can make a real difference.
And that's exactly what you helped me do, Annie. And I will be forever grateful to you. So thank you, thank you, thank you.
You're so welcome. It was my absolute honor. I'm so thankful for you.
Love you so much. We'll talk
See
soon.
you
Bye,
soon.
everyone.